Hi, welcome back. In this session, I'd like to talk about CEO turnover, the process by which CEOs leave companies, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes forced, and the consequences for investors. And I'm going to use the corporate life cycle, one of my favorite structures, to talk about why CEOs might need to change for the good of the company. Now, of course, this particular post was triggered by a news story that I'm sure many of you read last week, that Jack Dorsey was stepping down as CEO of Twitter. Now, by itself, that's just a news story, but what happened in the market next was interesting because the stock price jumped almost 10%. Now, it did give up most of that increase in the days after, but the question is, why would Dorsey leaving Twitter, a founder leaving the company, be viewed as good news? Now, of course, his replacement, his handpicked successor, Parag Agrawal, is the new CEO, and we don't know much about him. And part of what I think investors are debating is he the right CEO for Twitter at this point in their life? So I want to look at that question. What makes for a great CEO? How do you decide whether you got the right CEO? And does that change as companies change? Now, before we do that, I want to deal with what I call the myth of the great CEO. This notion that there's this collection of qualities that make for a great CEO, no matter what kind of company you are. And I'm going to use two institutions that are heavily invested in this myth to illustrate my point. The first is the Harvard Business School, where every entering student is treated as a CEO in waiting, and the Harvard Business Review, which is perhaps read by more CEOs than any other publication. This is actually from one of the articles that describes what goes into a great CEO. And it lists 4 characteristics that a great CEO has. They decide with speed and conviction. They engage for impact with employees in the outside world. They adapt proactively to changing circumstances, and they deliver reliably. None of those seems like a bad characteristics. In fact, I would argue that these would be good characteristics for anybody to have, including a CEO. So you're saying, so what? That sounds pretty reasonable. Let's move on to the second institution, which is heavily invested in the CEO business, McKinsey. McKinsey, of course, is a consulting firm, but it's also true that more McKinsey consultants have become CEOs than perhaps any other feed-in institution. So you must know a few things about what makes for a great CEO. So this is from one of those McKinsey quarterly articles that describes what goes into a great CEO. Excellent CEOs, according to this article, have 6 elements. They focus on beating the odds. They manage performance and health. They put dynamics ahead of mechanics. They help directors help the business. They center on the long-term why. And they do only what they can do. Again, each of these elements sounds like something you'd like a person to have. So you're saying, so what? Now, of course, this mythology of a great CEO has also been fed by books and movies about great CEOs. In fact, I'll use 3 famous CEOs to illustrate my point. The first is Warren Buffett. There are more books written about Warren Buffett than any other investor/CEO in history. And after all, remember, Warren Buffett was CEO for Berkshire Hathaway for much of its rise to glory. Now, of course, describing the books about Buffett as biographies is probably charitable. They're more like hagiographies because they treat him like a god. And I think they do a disservice to him by doing it, but they describe his qualities and they're all impressive, right? Seems like a kind and a humble man, grounded. Now, let's go to a different name, Jack Welch. In his day, those stars dimmed a little bit since GE's fall from grace. Jack Welch was viewed as an incredibly good CEO. There were books about him, again, talking about what he did at GE that brought this company that was a mature company to growth. And then there's Steve Jobs. The man, the legend. There are books about him. There's even a movie, in fact, a couple of movies about him, though they tend to gloss over his first iteration. People forget that Steve Jobs, in his first round at Apple, almost destroyed the company. And he came back in 2000 and he turned the company around. My point is these books and movies paint a picture of, hey, these are the qualities that make for a great CEO. I'll tell you why I'm skeptical about both the Harvard Business Review, McKinsey slant on great CEOs, as well as these books about great CEOs. Let's assume that HBR and McKinsey are right about the qualities that go into a successful CEO, and you listed some of them. Here's the truth. A lot of people with those qualities never become CEOs. So while successful CEOs might have those qualities, having those qualities doesn't seem to make people successful CEOs. So I have a question, is there a missing ingredient here that allowed only some of these people to succeed? Second, I find it odd that all of the qualities listed in the HBR and the McKinsey articles were good ones. Now, I think there are some other qualities that CEOs possess that we might not think of as great qualities. For instance, there's substantial evidence that CEOs of companies tend to be overconfident. That overconfidence is what allows them to act decisively, take long-term perspectives, be okay when they're wrong. But let's face it, overconfidence can cut both ways. You make big bets based on that overconfidence. If they don't pay off, you fail. If they pay off, you succeed. Is history being written by the winners here? Which is, maybe these same qualities that make for the most successful CEOs might be the qualities that characterize the least successful ones. Maybe luck should be one of the factors that's listed as needed for a great CEO. And finally, and this I think needs to be brought into the discussion, there are some successful CEOs, even great CEOs in some people's minds, who don't possess these qualities. Let's take Elon Musk and Mark Benioff, CEOs of Tesla and Salesforce, two incredibly successful companies. I'm sure there will be many people who will call them great CEOs, but I will leave it up to you to take each of these men, put them through that list and ask yourself, do they share those qualities? Because I don't think they do. So while much as we might believe this myth of a great CEO, it doesn't seem to hold up to scrutiny. So I'm going to present a different way of thinking about a great CEO. And in my structure, there is no one great CEO. It depends on where your company is in the corporate life cycle. You're saying, what are you talking about? You probably heard me talk about corporate life cycles where companies are born, startups, they are young toddlers, they become teenage companies in the peak of their lives. They become middle-aged, mature growth companies, mature stable companies, and then they age and die. Morbid thought, but companies go through that cycle. And at each stage there are transitions, where your idea becomes a product, your product becomes a business, your business scales up, and essentially at each stage you got to make through these transitions. The right CEO for your company will depend on where you are in this process. When you have an idea, you want somebody who can come up with ideas, maybe a technology person. But to sell that idea to people who want to work for you, to investors, you need a storyteller. Your perfect CEO, if you're a young startup, is a visionary. Let's call that CEO Steve the Visionary. Now, as you start to make your product and you start to build a business, you have to accept compromises. Visionaries who are purists crash and burn. Visionaries are willing to make compromises, build businesses. So let's say the perfect CEO, as you go from pure vision to a business, is a pragmatist. Paula the pragmatist. I'm trying as hard as I can to cut across so I can't be accused of being sexist and have all male CEOs. As you go from young growth to high growth, you need somebody who can build a business. Okay? The perfect CEO for you is Bob the Builder. Now, as you build the business and you scale up, you're going to discover that you start to hit some barriers, and to grow then you've got to look for either extensions of existing products or extensions of existing geographies. You got to be an opportunist. Oscar the opportunist. And now you've built a nice mature business. Your growth is behind you, but you have a great business. You know what you need to do? You need to defend that business against the competition. You need Donna the defender. And finally, you're going to decline. And you know who you need as your perfect CEO? You need Larry the Liquidator. In fact, if you get a chance, Google up Larry the Liquidator. Danny DeVito played that role in a movie called Other People's Money. And you're going to see very quickly what the characteristics are that make for Larry the Liquidator. You tell me where you are in the life cycle and I will find the CEO for you, but the characteristics are going to vary depending on whether you're early in the life cycle when I'm going to go for a visionary, whether you're building a business, whether you're defending a mature business or you're a declining company. Now, the reason I'm making this is when you look at that list, you can already see why a CEO is great at one type of company might not be great at another one. You can have mismatches happen between CEOs and the companies they're given to run. And there are three reasons these mismatches can happen. The first is the board of directors just makes a mistake. They pick somebody who's been successful in another company, but it was a very different company. So the first is it's a mistake. I remember when Uber was looking for a new CEO in 2017. And they looked briefly at Jeff Immelt. Jeff was CEO at GE, and we can debate whether he did a good job or a bad job. But even if you thought he did a good job, this would have been a horrifically bad mistake. What made him successful at GE would not have helped him in the least at Uber, a very different company at a very different stage in the life cycle. The second reason you can have a mismatch can be deliberate. A board of directors of a mature company picks a visionary. You know what they're hoping will happen, right? By picking a visionary, they hope that the company will go back to being a growth company. It's a gamble, and in my view, the gamble seldom works. I still remember when Yahoo in 2012, and remember Yahoo in 2012 was a declining company. I mean, after all, when you have a search engine that fewer and fewer people search on, and a mail program that only people over the age of 75 use, your days are numbered. So what did they do? The board at Yahoo hired Marissa Mayer, an incredibly successful executive from Google, hoping that she could turn Yahoo into a growth company again. You can't blame her for trying, and she tried, but 5 years later, Yahoo ended up in the dust heap of corporate America, and the reason was simple. The business could not be changed. And finally, there's a third reason mismatches happen, and that is companies can change. In other words, you're a founder, you start a great company, you're a visionary, you push the company to the forefront, it becomes a bigger company, and now you're trying to build the company, but you don't have the skills needed to build the company. The mismatch happens because the company changes, but the CEO hasn't. Example again, going back to Uber, was Travis Kalanick, who was the CEO of the company as it was built up. It was perfect for the company in its early years. He was a visionary and a rule breaker, and when you're building a disruptive company that's breaking the rules all the time, he was a perfect match. But by 2017, even without the personal problems he had, I'd have argued that he'd outlived his welcome at Uber, that he was no longer the right person for the company. So when mismatches happen, there are consequences, and they can range from the benign to very malignant. In the most benign scenario, let's suppose a mismatch happens. Let's say the company has changed and you don't have the skill set needed to be the custodian of that company. In the benign scenario, that founder CEO or the mismatched CEO recognizes that he or she doesn't have the skills, but then finds a partner or a co-executive and gives that partner or co-executive enough powers to make the changes or make the decisions that are made. I'll use Steve Jobs to illustrate my point. I told you there were two iterations of Steve Jobs. The first one, he almost caused Apple to crash and burn because he let his vision drive every choice and he was not pragmatic. I owned the Lisa computer that he put together in the mid-80s. Horrifically bad mistake because it's a computer that was really not designed to be for long-term use. They say, what made Steve Jobs successful in his second go-around at Apple? Well, part of it was he was older, perhaps a little wiser. He'd started a company called Pixar in the meantime and learned something about building companies. But I think the biggest difference was a man he hired as chief operating officer, Tim Cook. Now, here's what Steve did, and you've got to give him credit. He said, I'll take care of the vision thing. I'll wear that black turtleneck and go in front of big crowds and tell the crowds what Apple's doing that's exciting and different. But he gave the power to Tim Cook to make sure that the iPhone that he'd promised people could actually be made and delivered. Tim Cook made the trains run on time. The production happened. The supply chains continued to work. And that was critical in Apple's success. That's a benign scenario. The malignant scenario, the mismatched CEO doesn't realize he or she is mismatched, continues to push the company down a path it should be going, destroys the company. And there's an intermediate scenario. If there is any essence of corporate governance in this company, it's a public company, perhaps the board will act and replace that mismatched CEO. If that happens, there's still some damage done, and the longer you wait, the more the damage, but it lies somewhere between the benign and the malignant scenario. So CEO company mismatches are never good news. Now, I'm going to go back to the life cycle and talk about something that has changed in the life cycle that should make us all more wary about picking a CEO and entrenching them for life. I talked about how companies are born, they grow, they mature, they decline, and then they die, right? Let's think about what are the forces that that make a life cycle evolve the way it does. When you think about how quickly companies can grow, that's determined by how capital intensive business is, how much access people have to capital, how much investment is needed. Capital intensive businesses, where there's a long lag between setting up the business and production happening, will take longer to grow. How quickly you scale up will depend again on how much additional capital you need, and how much inertia there is in the process. Are customers willing to switch quickly? Then you get to the top, and how long you stay at the top will depend on how many new entrants are in this business and how quickly they can climb up the ladder. I'm going to make a point. Businesses where it takes a long time to build a business because your big infrastructure needs long time lags, lots of capital needed, will also be businesses where you're likely to stay at the top for longer and where decline will be slow because the same forces will work in your favor once you get to the top. Conversely, businesses where you can ascend quickly because there's very low capital intensity, there's very little customer inertia, will also be businesses where you descend very quickly. And here's where I think we need to bring in what's changed in the 21st century, or at least even towards the end of the 20th century. The classic 20th century company, and you take Ford or GE or Sears Roebuck, took a long time to build. 30, 40, 50, 60 years. They didn't go from 0 to 100 billion in 3 years. It took them a long time to build. The benefit of taking a long time to build is they stayed at the top for decades. And when the decline happened, it took decades again. GE, for instance, the thing went public in the late 1800s. It's been around a long time. It's had a 130-year life. And even though now I think of it as a Walking Dead company, it's had a long life. Same thing for Sears Roebuck or Ford. In contrast, think about Yahoo. Founded in 1994, became a $100 billion company by 1999 in 5 years. Lasted at the top for about 5 years before Google came along, then went into decline and was done as a company by 2017. Start to finish, 23 years. That's why I've described tech companies as aging in dog years. A 20-year tech company, I've argued, is like a 100-year manufacturing company. You think, so what? It has implications for management. In the 1900s, if you look at a Ford or a GE or a GM, time took care of CEO change. I mean, Henry Ford became CEO of Ford, which was then a young startup in 1906. And in a sense, he was the perfect CEO for Ford. He had the vision to see automobiles as a mass market product. He made it happen by creating assembly lines that had economies of scale. He had his little quirks, right? He sold Model T only in black. But in the early stages of Ford's life, he was the perfect CEO. Now, he stayed on as CEO for almost 40 years. He probably outlived his welcome by the time he got to the end. But by the time he left, it was time for him to go. But time took care of the problem. He left because he got old. Maybe died. And his grandson became CEO, and he was the right CEO for Ford. until he outlived his welcome. My point is, for the 20th century company, because it took so much time to go from startup to decline, CEOs changed because they got pushed to change. Time took care of the problem. But if the 21st century company is going to look more like Yahoo than Ford, you go from start to end in 23 years, we're going to have some issues. In fact, in many of these tech companies, look at founder CEOs, there are two divergent pieces of evidence on founder CEOs at tech companies. The first is in the first year, 2, maybe 3 years after businesses started up, there's a significant amount of turnover at these companies. 35% of CEOs get replaced. Many are pushed out by VCs or investors bringing in capital. Some leave on their own. You think, why would they? They face what Noah Wasserman at Harvard calls the founder's dilemma, which is faced with the choice between being in complete control of a small, less valuable company or giving up control and getting a more valuable company and letting somebody else run it. Some founders choose the latter. So on the one hand, there is evidence that a lot of founder CEOs are pushed out of these companies early in the process. But a few of these founder CEOs survive at these companies. They actually bring these companies to scaling, and then they take these companies off in public. And when you have a founder that stays at the helm of a company all the way through, that founder is prized. In fact, many people, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, think of that founder as special. There's a version of founder worship where these founders are put in pedestals and any kind of challenge to them is viewed as bad. You're saying, so what? Well, in the last 20 years, those founder CEOs have played off that founder worship to add features to these companies that entrench them in power. Shares with different voting rights. Remember, prior to Google coming along, in the US, companies issued shares with only one vote. They all were in the same voting class. Since Google came along, companies with different class of shares in terms of voting rights are more the rule than the exception. And I think more than ever, endowing companies with these entrenchment powers, increased powers to fend off challenges, is a mistake, and here's why. If life cycles are compressing, you might think that the CEO of a company that's gone public right now is the right CEO for the company right now. But in 3 or 4 years, that company might have changed so much that this CEO might no longer match. And you will want to change that CEO, but you've given up the power to do so. If I were an investor in these companies, and I'm an investor in a few, I worry about the fact that we as investors have voluntarily given up that power at these companies by choosing to buy the second-class voting rights shares. So I would expect this to be an issue as we go in time. And if you're saying, well, how do you explain Twitter? Twitter was one of those few tech companies that did not create two classes of shares. So maybe that's why Jack Dorsey is leaving and Mark Zuckerberg is not. The implications for investors is simple. And you invest in these young companies early in the life cycle, you're not just investing in a story, you're also investing in the person telling the story that you hope will deliver on that story. And if you have a compressed corporate life cycle and the potential for mismatch, it adds a layer of uncertainty to your valuation, because not only do you have to judge whether the person telling the story is well equipped to run the company now, but whether they're well equipped to run the company in the long term. And to the extent that the founder is the lead manager and the narrative setter, any concern you have about founders will play out in how you value a company. I'll give you 3 examples where I've kind of used this insight to think about companies. My first is Amazon, a company I've valued every year since 1997, one of my favorite companies to value. And people are often surprised when I tell them that prior to 2013, if you'd ask people, even investors, who Amazon's CEO was, relatively few people had heard of Jeff Bezos. Now, today, of course, he's a household name, partly because he bought the Washington Post, became part of, the public discourse. But one reason I've always attached lofty values to Amazon is not just that I like their business model, but I've liked the people running the company. I liked Amazon when it was a tiny money-losing company. And I liked it when it was a bigger money-making company. And I like it because Jeff Bezos has told the same story for the company for almost its entire life. I call it the Field of Dreams story, where essentially he said, look, if we build it, the revenues, they will come. And he's acted consistently. He built a management team early on that could deliver on that story. He did not make Amazon a company that was built around his personality. So when he did decide to step down in July of 2021, is it any surprise that the stock price did not collapse? Good founders create companies that outlast them. I think of Bill Gates. He stepped down as CEO when he didn't have to. He had the power to stay on if he wanted to. But he said, look, I've built a great company. I have a team that I trust to run the company. I'm willing to walk away. When you invest in a company that you think is going to scale up to become a very large company, you want to also think about whether you have a founder CEO who's willing to let go. Let's move to Twitter. I valued Twitter for the first time ahead of its IPO in 2013. I built a model premised on the notion that it could become an online advertising company that would make money. At that time, its biggest sales pitch, its biggest competitive advantage was 240 million users. Pretty impressive, right? In the years since, I've been open about the fact that I'm frustrated with Twitter's inability to convert its users to money. And one reason for that is I think Jack Dorsey was ill-suited to make that conversion. I don't know Mr. Dorsey. He seems like a brilliant man, but he also was quite clear that he was going to try to run two companies at the same time, Twitter and Square. And it was troubling when he said a couple of years ago that he planned to spend some 6 months in Africa. Everybody's entitled to take a break, and if you want to make that break in Africa, all the more power to you. But you can't continue to run two companies in absentia. So one reason I think the market responded so positively to his stepping down is I think there was a recognition that there was a mismatch here. The 10% jump reflected that. I think the reason it's given it back is I'm not sure that his successor is the right match yet. It's still early. We don't know whether Parag Agrawal will be able to turn the company into the company it should be. He has time to make his case, but he's on probation. Investors are going to look to see whether he can monetize these users much better than Dorsey did. One final example: a few months ago, I valued Paytm, India's an online payment processing company in India, with a lot of promise because it comes from the Indian online payment processing market growing, and Paytm being one of the first players in the market. I did value Paytm at about 2,200 rupees per share. But I told a big story, a story of a company continuing to grow, but increasingly being able to take its 330 million users and gross merchandise value that runs into the billions of rupees and convert it to revenues. The way you convert it was the take rate, and those revenues to profits. That requires actually taking a company that historically has focused primarily on getting users and converting those users into revenues and profits. Now, of course, the company went public around 2150, very close to my estimated value, but then dropped. The stock price collapsed like a rock. It was actually less than 1,400 rupees a few days after going public. It's now settled into 1,600 to 1,700 rupees. And I've been, the question is, what happened? Why in a market where every growth company seems to be received so well did Paytm collapse? I think, it's one reason I think is I think that the founders and bankers of the company played their cards badly in the days leading up to the IPO. Let's face it, the big challenge that anybody looking at Paytm had was not that their capacity to build up users or add services. It's whether the company had the capacity to convert those users into revenues, a take rate, and those revenues into profits. What I expected to hear in the days leading into the IPO was something from the founders and bankers about how they plan to do that. I didn't hear that. I heard talk about how they would continue to build up users. If there was talk about contribution margins, almost in passing. I think that it's still early in the game. There's a chance to recoup. But I think if I were Vijay Sharma, CEO, founder of the company, I would talk a lot more about take rates and building a business and a lot less about adding more services and users as you go through. Which leaves me with one final point or final topic I want to talk about in this context of CEO change. In much of the world, if you look at even publicly traded companies, many of them are controlled by family groups. It reflects the history of many economies where family groups built up businesses, and those businesses have now gone public. To see why the core life cycle story applies to family group companies, it's worth remembering that family group companies often control companies in multiple businesses in different stages in the life cycle. So you might have a financial service company, a steel company, a manufacturing company, and a technology company all within the same family group. So so when you look at family group companies, they're across the spectrum, ranging from young growth companies at one end to declining companies in the other. In fact, one reason family group companies grew is they have an intra-group capital market. In other words, they can take cash from companies that are more mature or declining and put them into young growth companies. And when they were private businesses, that's exactly what they did. As public companies, it gets trickier because you are taking, cash out of one publicly traded company and putting in another. And it might be that the shareholders would prefer that you not do that. They make their own choices. Now let's think about how management turnover, CEO turnover plays out at these companies. Studies, not surprisingly, show that when you look at family group companies, family member CEOs are very seldom pushed out. It's very, very unusual to see a forced push out of a family member CEO, partly because it's the family group doing the pushing. And that can become a problem in a world where family group companies are invested across multiple businesses that are in different stages of the life cycle. Now, I've talked to family group companies over time, and they're aware of the fact that markets don't trust them, that they don't, that they worry about this mismatch. And here are some suggestions I would have if you're a family group company thinking about dealing with this mismatch, because it can happen. First, if you're a family group company, I think that, or family group, you have to think about making power more diffuse. What I mean by that is many family groups follow a patriarch. And the reason I say patriarch is many of them are led by men, many older, who essentially decide for the entire group what the right thing to do is. It's a powerful family leader at the top of the family group. I think we need to move away from that towards more of a committee structure where power is more diffuse across family members, because you need different perspectives when you have companies at different stages in the life cycle. Second, somebody's got to be doing an assessment of where different businesses within the same family group are in the life cycle. Which ones are declining, which ones are mature, which ones are growing, which ones are young startups. Third, if you restrict your management to just family members, there are going to be businesses within the family group that you might not be able to staff. For instance, if you have a young startup portion of your business and none of your family members are visionaries, let's face it, there is no requirement that every family have a visionary in it. You will need to draw on an outsider or outsiders to run these businesses, and not just hire them, but give them the power to make the decisions. As many family group companies enter the technology space, I think that's a challenge they're going to face is, you might not have the visionary storyteller within the family. You might have to hire an outsider and give them the freedom to make their own mistakes. And if there's a mismatch between a company and a family member CEO, somebody's got to be willing to make that decision to remove that family. It's not going to be easy. It's a family. It's going to create frictions that go beyond business. But it's something that family groups have to at least create a structure to be able to deal with. What does it mean for investors? For better or worse, if you think about family group companies, there's mixed research. Some suggest there are better investments than investing in non-family group companies, others worse. And I'm not surprised, because to see why they can help or hurt, I think it's worth thinking again about the corporate life cycle. In the portions of the life cycle where patience and a steady hand are required, it's good to have a family group CEO, because a family member CEO, because they're for the long term. They think about value because it's their business. They're over invested in it. So if you have a lot of mature businesses in steady state, then a family group company might actually be better than a non-family group company. On the other hand, if family CEO is entrenched in a company that's transitioning from growth to mature or mature to declining, you have a problem, because it's going to be very difficult to get change in that company. So family group companies, where you have companies that are stretched across the life cycle, investors are going to be more nervous about these companies, because the question is this family capable of being dynamic enough to deal across the group? So in conclusion, I think this search for the perfect CEO is misplaced. I think the right CEO for your company, if you're a board of directors looking for a CEO, has to start by looking at what you need as a company. And then when you assess candidates, you got to assess not just their past track record at the companies they used to run, but the qualities they brought to that position. If you don't match a CEO to the company you're trying to hire that CEO for, I don't care what the track record of the person you're hiring is, you're still going to find in hindsight that you made a mistake. I hope you found the session useful, and thank you very much for listening.